Hey friends, it's an honor to be with you today, and I get a chance to talk about my passion around the Beatitudes. Recently, I published a book on this topic called The Ninefold Path of Jesus, Hidden Wisdom in the Beatitudes. So Beatitudes, what does that mean? It's something about blessing. The Greek word there is makarios, and it means something like, oh my goodness, this person really has it going on. It's an honorific term that would be used to describe your favorite sports hero, Queen Beyonce, the musician, or your favorite billionaire who builds rockets. The idea is whoever is given this honor of being called blessed is makarios, is someone who lives at a higher level than most of us. They've truly been blessed by God or the gods. And just to put it in context for us to appreciate Jesus' use of this term makarios in this passage is who he calls blessed. My mentor, Dallas Willard, used to describe it like this. He said, imagine Jesus speaking on the side of that hill. And first he sees a guy who barely has clothes on his back. And he says, blessed are the poor. Yours is the kingdom of heaven. And then he sees a woman in mourning who's just lost her partner and says, blessed are those who mourn. You're going to be comforted. And the crowd was probably wondering, why is Jesus calling all of these losers blessed? Because in their culture, much like ours, the thought was if you're especially wealthy, successful, or attractive, you're blessed. And if you don't have those things, if you're sick, lonely, or poor, you're cursed. And Jesus turns it on its head here, suggesting that nobody gets left out. Nobody gets left behind. The good things of life with God are available to all of us. Whatever your story, whatever your situation, this way of Jesus is available to you. And I don't know about you, but that strikes me as good news for me. Sometimes I feel left out or left behind, and it's good to be reminded God's life is available to us in this very moment, in the circumstances we find ourselves in. So in addition to that, I see the placement of the Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, something like a table of contents for the topics that Jesus is going to speak about in the next 3 chapters or 110 verses. And what I think is going on is that Jesus is naming in the Beatitudes 9 aspects of our human experience and the human condition, and describing how we can respond to life in those areas of our experience in 9 new ways, 9 new postures for life. So play with this with me for a moment. I'm suggesting that we have some first instincts about how we respond to life. And those instincts were maybe helpful for our survival, but not helpful for our thriving. And so we have to make a flip to move from that first instinct into a more reasoned, a more contemplative, a more conscious and broader awareness of the reality that we live in. This will probably become more clear as I go through each of the Beatitudes, and I can help you make some sense of it. So let's go to the first one. Jesus says, blessed are the poor, or the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And as I go through, I'm going to invite you to take on some body postures with me, both for our first instinct and for a chosen posture, the posture of the kingdom that we're invited into. So what does it mean to be poor? Poverty is when you don't have enough, or you feel like you don't have enough. Something's lacking. And our first instinct when we encounter our sense of poverty is to grab and grasp, to operate from a mentality of scarcity. This would suggest the fight or flight response. And with this beatitude, Jesus is inviting us to go from this posture of anxiety to a posture of openness and trust. We don't have enough to make it on our own, but we're connected to the ultimate source of life. And so this is why Jesus said things like, don't worry. and sell your possessions to give to the poor. That if we can learn to live life in a posture of hope and handedness, our needs will be met and we'll have the resources to share with others. So I'm going to invite you to open your hands and consider a few questions. Where in your life do you feel like you don't have enough or that you're not enough? How have you closed your hands in worry or striving? I want to invite you to open your hands to the care and presence of your Creator. What are you appreciating about this day and this moment? What are your desires? Jesus said, ask, seek, and knock. Everything you need is here. Then Jesus goes on to say, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Wow, that's like saying, happy are those who are unhappy. Pain avoidance is one of our first instincts. You touch a hot stove, your hand pulls away. And we know that from childhood, but as we've grown older, when we face things in our lives that are too difficult for us, that seem too scary, our first instinct is to numb out or do whatever we can to avoid those painful experiences. But as anyone in recovery knows, running from pain rarely helps. And so with great wisdom, with this beatitude, Jesus invites us to, rather than run from pain or numb out from our pain, that we actually sit with what's hard. So I'm going to ask you a few questions about this. When you look at our world, what breaks your heart? What makes you feel sad? Where do you feel loneliness, pain, disappointment, or loss? And I want to remind you, God is here. Don't run away. You can face the pain and wait for the comfort that is near. It may come when you least expect it. Then Jesus says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. One of our first instincts, and it's the way that we initially develop our sense of personal identity, is by asking questions like, who's taller and who's shorter? Who's better at reading or not as good at reading? Who's the fastest runner? Do you remember doing these things when you were young? And we continue to do that as a way of trying to figure out what our ranking is. Are we greater than or less than? And as you can imagine, this kind of thinking leads to a lot of competition and struggle in our world and a lot of inequality. And Jesus was creating a community that would contradict our tendency towards hierarchical thinking. And one of the signature demonstrations of this is when he washed his disciples' feet. So I want to ask you a question. Where do you struggle with competition and comparisons? How do you get caught in the trap of feeling greater than or less than others? I'm going to invite you to gently place your hand on your heart. We're invited to, rather than basing our sense of self on earning or achieving or competing and comparing, to instead affirm what's essential about us. And I want to remind you, you are made in God's image, and you have inherent dignity and worth. And as we learn to internalize that, it will help us to honor the equal dignity and worth of others. Then Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger for justice. Looking around the world with the climate crisis and struggles around inequality and racism, human trafficking, the way women are treated in so many places, it's easy to look and go, what can we possibly do about these overwhelming problems? And I think our first instinct, or one of our first instincts, is towards learned helplessness. And we can see the problems, but we wonder if we have the agency or power to do anything about them. So I'm going to invite you into a couple of questions about this, because Jesus doesn't think we're helpless or hopeless. He said, you are the light of the world. Let your light shine. So I want you to put your hand across your heart like this. Think Wakanda or Wonder Woman. What's the thirst for justice that's inside of you? How would you like the world to become different and better? You and I are powerful beings. We shape the world by our choices. How will you join the work God is doing to make all things new today? Then Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." One of the ways we develop a sense of a moral compass is by asking questions like, who's the good guy and the bad guy in the story? Or am I a good girl or a bad girl? We make assessments and judgments about our behavior and others' behavior. And we want ourselves and others to be punished if we don't live up to those standards. And as you can imagine, this posture of the pointing finger is so destructive to our sense of ourselves, and it's so destructive to the people that we look down on and label and judge. And this is why Jesus later in the sermon says, "Do not judge, and forgive, and you will be forgiven." Instead, we're invited to see ourselves and others through the lens of grace or compassion. So I invite you to make a shape of a heart with your hand and consider these questions. For what in your life do you need mercy? And who do you struggle to forgive or find yourself judging? I want to remind you, you are deeply loved. And mercy dares us to believe that the truest thing about us is not that we're broken or flawed, but that we are beloved. Is there any resentment that you need to let go of? I invite you to see yourself and others through eyes of compassion today. Then Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." There's an archetypal story in the book of Genesis about when Adam and Eve made a choice and felt seen, and their first instinct was to run and to hide. Psychologists talk about this as our search for a persona, a way that we protect ourselves from being fully seen, a mask that we wear. And with great courage, with this beatitude, Jesus is inviting us to take off our masks, to step into the light, to be truly honest about where we're at. And the promise is that if we will be honest and step into the light, allow ourselves to be seen by God and trusted others, that we'll be forgiven and made new. And so a couple of questions. You can first hold this up like a mask. What mask do you tend to wear? Where is there a divide between what's in your heart and what you're willing to show others? And I want to remind you, and you can do this posture of open-handedness, of right motive. God sees all. I invite you to step into the light of your Creator's tender gaze. Allow yourself to be seen and known. Examine your motives. How can you be more honest, true, and wholehearted today? Then Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." I believe our first instinct is towards us and them thinking. My family, my country, my political party, my sports team, and yours over there, with so much oppositional energy. We probably do this because we're trying to create a sense of ourselves based on group identity. And that's what leads to this. Well, Jesus invites us to move from this us and them mentality into a new posture of embrace. And he modeled this for us. He often crossed boundaries to connect with forgotten or marginalized groups of people, with women, with ethnic minorities, even with his Roman oppressors. And so I'm going to invite you to do this posture of peacemaker, of reaching out. Stretch out your arms, reach out to embrace, and consider these questions. Where do you feel conflict or difference from others? Who do you tend to put on the other side of us and them? Reality is that we are all sons and daughters of one divine parent, members of one family. There are no sides. we belong to one another. Who do you feel invited to reach out to, reconcile, or connect with today? Then Jesus says, blessed are those mistreated for justice. When someone cuts me off in traffic or says something insulting to me, the first thing I want to do is to fight. And I don't always have the courage to actually confront them directly, but I'll try and form alliances around me and say, can you believe what that guy did to me? I believe our first instinct is to react defensively when we're confronted with bad behavior or disrespect. And Jesus invites us to move from this posture of resistance and fighting to a new posture of nonviolence and surrender. It's one of the most radical and countercultural aspects of the gospel. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek. And so I want you to adopt with me this posture of nonviolence, of surrender, as if in a rest, and consider a couple of questions. How have you been mistreated in your life? Maybe for even trying to do good. Where is there suffering in your life right now? We're each part of a cosmic struggle between good and evil. This means that suffering is inevitable, but not final. God is with those who suffer. Resist evil, embrace suffering, commit to doing good no matter what the cost, because in the end, love will finally win. And finally, Jesus said, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Psychologists and philosophers speculate that fear of death or fear of non-existence is one of the most primal driving forces in human behavior. We have a propensity to look out on the world and see ourselves as small and ourselves as separated. And if we're not careful, we'll act from a sense of fear rather than courage and love. Well, Jesus demonstrated overcoming this fear of death, and it brought and to take love to its final conclusions. And he transcended his fear to offer his life for us on the cross, and proved that death is not final, that life comes after life. And then he turned to his friends and he said, no one has greater love than this, than that they would lay down their life for a friend. And so we're being invited to move from this posture of fear to a posture of courage and radical love. How would you live if you weren't afraid to die? How are you being called to love more courageously and more radically? So in my study for this book, I looked at some words by somebody named E. Stanley Jones, who happened to be a friend of Mahatma Gandhi's. In fact, he wrote a book about Gandhi that fell into the hands of a young man named Martin Luther King Jr. And in that book, he described his nonviolent approach towards social and political change, Satyagraha. And it's a little known fact that Mahatma Gandhi read the Sermon on the Mount, including the Beatitudes, most days of his adult life, and that his approach to nonviolence was taken directly from these words of Jesus. And commenting in his book on the Sermon on the Mount, E. Stanley Jones said, a little man in a loincloth in India picks out from the Sermon on the Mount one of its central principles, applies it as a method for gaining human freedom, and the world, challenged and charmed, bends over to catch the significance of this sight. It is a portent of what would happen if we would take the whole of the Sermon on the Mount and apply it to the whole of life. It would renew our Christianity, and it would renew our world. Imagine how our world would be different if you and I could go from those first instincts of the human condition and move towards the higher consciousness and reality of God's kingdom of love. How it would change us and how it would change our world. In conclusion, I want to invite you to pray with me a prayer inspired by the Beatitudes and these postures that I've described to you. Almighty Creator, today, may we live with open hands. May we mourn what's broken. May we serve one another from self-respect. May we use our power for good. Look with compassion. Walk in honesty. Reach past our differences and suffer for love. And live fearlessly, following the way of radical love. So I'll leave you with this question. Out of those 9 invitations to move from first instincts to higher consciousness or the reality of the kingdom of love, which one of them pricked your heart the most or spoke to you? How are you being invited to move in a new way? And I invite you to consider what practices might help you to live towards the higher call of the kingdom of God. Peace.